It is just past 1 o'clock in the morning, on the 14th of April 1912, and a 46-year-old man in evening dress is having a glass of champagne in the first-class smoking room of a ship that has struck an iceberg 300 miles south of Newfoundland. He knows the ship is going down. He has already given up his seat in a lifeboat to one of his own servants, a steward, by some accounts his mistress's maid. He is telling the steward in sentence fragments in 3 languages, the message he wants delivered to his wife in New York. He will be remembered at the pier in another 9 hours as the man who came back on the Titanic in a deck chair and an ermine overcoat, his pockets stuffed with the evening clothes he had refused to change out of because, according to the message he gave the steward, he had played the game to the end. His name was Benjamin Guggenheim. He was one of 7 brothers. He was the heir most likely to have been remembered, had any of them been remembered at all. And he was not the only brother whose story ended that way. He was only the most theatrical. The family we are talking about tonight is the Guggenheims. Their name is on a museum in New York that tourists walk around the outside of, slightly confused about whether it is a building or a sculpture. Their name is on a fellowship that has paid the rent of more American writers, painters, scientists, and scholars than any private foundation most people have ever heard of. Their name is on a mining company that controlled, for about 40 years, the production of silver, copper, and lead across most of the Americas, and whose smelters in some towns became the cause of a kind of slow-motion poisoning that has only been unwound in the courts. They were, in their brief season, among the 6 or 7 most powerful families in the United States, and most of their children, by the time the family was over, were living in exile. The story of the Guggenheims tells you something about the cost of inheriting a fortune when you are not the one meant to inherit it, and it tells you something about the cost, you might as well hear it now, of building a fortune by stripping it out of the ground. To begin at the beginning, you have to go to a village called Lingnau in the Jewish canton of Aargau in northwest Switzerland in the first half of the 19th century. The village had one of the last working Jewish communities in the country that was permitted to live there. Their rights fluctuated with the weather of Swiss opinion. They could do certain trades. They could not own real property. They could lend money under constant restriction. They could not, mostly, become anything. Meyer Guggenheim was born in 1828 into a family of small traders. He was educated in catechism and arithmetic. By his early 20s, he had decided to leave. In 1847, carrying a small case and what was reported to be a handful of trade goods, he landed in America. He did not, at first, intend to become a mining man. He tried selling coffee. He tried selling soap. He tried, of all things, dry goods, with a college-age cousin who died young and left him with the inventory. The thing that pulled him up was lace. By the 1850s, he had figured out a route through the Swiss embroidery and lace trade, and his brothers, still in Lingnau, would ship him the bolts. The first generation of American Guggenheims built up a small Philadelphia outfitting firm that grew, by the end of the Civil War, into a respectable business in imported textiles. They were comfortable, they owned their building, they wore decent suits, they were not yet rich. What made them rich was not what anybody at home expected. In 1880, an American newspaper reported that 2 of the silver mines near the town of Leadville, high in the Colorado Rockies, were being sold for the price of a small house. Meyer Guggenheim, against the near-universal advice of his partners, in a decision his family later described in a half-dozen slightly different versions, scraped together roughly $5,000 and bought them. By the early 1880s, he had bought, consolidated, or held a share of most of the smelting capacity in the region. The mines paid off, slowly, then suddenly. The Guggenheims went from importers to mine owners to, within a few years, owners of the smelters that processed the metal out of the rock. Each link up the chain made them richer than the last, until by the late 1890s they controlled what was, in some years, close to a third of all the silver and lead output of the United States. That is the rise, and you can hear it in the way each of the brothers learned to speak about it later. Meyer never lost his Swiss-inflected English. He never lost his tiny penny notebook. He would walk into a mine office in Leadville and, according to reports, conduct an audit before any of his foremen had finished a coffee. The brothers grew up around the master, often doing the things he could not. Daniel went to Mexico and personally negotiated the terms of a mine concession when Daniel was barely 26. Solomon went to Boston and opened a smelting office that was, for a season, the only one that could reliably render a ton of low-grade lead ore. Murray went to the family's perfume supplies. Murray, in some accounts, never fully forgave the brothers who had gone into mining for leaving him there with the perfume. And then, for a while, they had everything. The Guggenheims owned mines on 3 continents. They had smelters in Mexico, in Chile, in the American Midwest, in the Pacific Northwest. They had a house on the Ile St. Louis in Paris, occupied some years by one of the brothers and some years by another. They had a mansion in Fairfield, Connecticut, set on a long sloping lawn that ran down to a cove on Long Island Sound, a place with its own stone boathouse and an indoor bowling alley. They had, by the early 20th century, an apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York, a house in the Adirondacks, and at least one of the brothers owned a ranch in the West that he was deeply proud of. The art came in this stretch. Solomon R. Guggenheim, the third brother from the oldest end of the family, was, by his middle years, an unofficial member of the New York avant-garde. He was introduced to modern painting by a German baroness named Hilla Riebe, who had happened to walk into his office in 1928 to ask for advice about selling a canvas, and who was never quite mistaken for anything ordinary afterward. Solomon began buying Kandinskys, Klees, and the like. He stopped wanting to know what they were worth. He began wanting to know what it would feel like to live inside them. Their social position was, for a stretch, the kind you only got by accident. You could meet the Guggenheims at a Long Island dinner party. You could meet them at the family box at the opera. You could meet them at the 18th Street house in New York that became their de facto headquarters, with its own private synagogue architecturally tiled to look like an ordinary room. And in the middle of all that, just as the family was supposed to be entering what later generations would call its golden age, the first crack showed in a way nobody could pretend was small. Meyer, the patriarch, was aging. The brothers argued about almost everything. Meyer had installed a profit-sharing plan for the mine workers that was, at the time, remarkably progressive for the industry. But the brothers had done it because Meyer had decided it was the right thing to do, not because they agreed, and the moment Meyer's authority weakened, the policy began to be quietly dispensed with on the ground. The brothers had different wives, different tastes, different political stripes, and the same last name. They had, according to most accounts, no system for resolving any family disagreement other than to tell Meyer, and no system at all once Meyer was gone. Solomon wanted to buy art. Daniel wanted to buy more mines. Benjamin wanted to live in Paris. Murray wanted nothing to do with any of it and was, by his late middle years, drinking too much and saying so. So when the family got the news from the North Atlantic on Monday, the 15th of April, 1912, they received it in a house that was already, in private, half uncertain of itself. Benjamin was gone. There would be no body to retrieve. The notice of his death arrived in the family office, and within 48 hours the other brothers had to do something none of them had prepared for. They had to choose, without consulting Benjamin's descendants, what the next century of the family would look like, and they had to do it while pretending to be in mourning, and while running several of the most leveraged businesses in the United States. Those next few months, that is the human part of this story, and it is worth slowing down for it, because this is where the dynasty started turning its slow, tragic circle. The brothers who survived Benjamin, 7 of Meyer Guggenheim's 10 children had been boys. 8 by now were living. Divided their attention between 3 sets of things: the public search for the body, the family code of honor about what to say in the press, and the question of who would be the new heir, now, to Benjamin's share. By the end of 1912, the family had quietly, with considerable legal skill, rewritten the trust that Meyer's children would draw from, in a way that gave Solomon, the art-loving brother, the lead voice in the family's future. Benjamin's widow, Florette, received a settlement, by some reports, of around $250,000, plus what would today be a modest real estate package. She would live the rest of her life in a small apartment on Park Avenue, raised partly out of the public eye, the last face a friend would see of the family in the Gilded Age, and about the only filiation that the late grandson, Harry, would know. What turned next was not the immediate aftermath, but the next generation. The sons of the brothers grew up in the long shadow of a man whose name they could not yet use. Harry Guggenheim, the son of Daniel, named for a brother killed in a mine accident years earlier, went into the mines, went into politics, and was, by most accounts, the most politically conservative Guggenheim, a loyal Republican and an advocate for the family business who never publicly broke with the family's industrial record. Hyman Guggenheim, the son of Meyer VII, had been born late into the family and had a mother's quiet determination behind the running of his mouth. He used his own share of the trust to enter politics in Colorado in the late 19th century, served 1 term in the United States Senate at the turn of the century, and then lost re-election in 1913. He lost that election, he would later tell a friend, the day he was forced by his family to support the family's position against the unionizing workers in the mines he used to champion. Theologians of the family would later write that Simon was the one who felt the inner pressure of the dynasty's contradictions most acutely. By the 1930s, the family was running a network of industrial operations that ran into the heart of every social question of the period. The American Smelting and Refining Company, ASARCO, was, by the early 1900s, the consolidated smelting operation that the family controlled in partnership with a competing Rockefeller outfit. ASARCO's smelters emitted lead and arsenic into the air over residential neighborhoods of El Paso, of Omaha, of Salt Lake City, and of a dozen other places. Hundreds of workers and their children were poisoned, slowly, by the air. There were strikes, there were lawsuits. There was, in the 1930s and 40s, an attempt by a U.S. attorney to indict the company for using armed strikebreakers in the labor disputes at ASARCO smelters in Colorado. The attempts never quite stuck. The men died anyway, and while all of that industrial hell was creeping along, Solomon was still buying art. He was buying Cleese in 1933 at the worst moment of the Depression. He and Baroness Rebay opened a small museum on West 54th Street in a building that everyone joked looked like a parking garage. He hired Frank Lloyd Wright in 1943 to draw up something that had never existed before. Wright began drawing the famous sketches. He kept drawing for 15 years. He died before the building opened, in April of 1959, and the building itself was immediately the most controversial museum in America. Critics called the inside of it a snail. Critics called the ramp a toboggan. Critics said that the curve of it made it impossible to see the paintings hanging on its concave walls. The building, of course, has been the most famous museum in New York since. But if the building stayed famous, the family, by the time it opened, had done something no one fully admitted. The Guggenheims had cut their holdings in a way that appeared, on paper, a deliberate plan to give their money away. They had set up the fellowship in 1925. They had set up the museum as a gift to the public, with the understanding, written and unwritten, that the family would continue to be present on the board, but not in the wallet. What probably happened, in retrospect, was that there was nothing left, by the late 50s, of the kind of American Guggenheim who would run an integrated mining empire from the United States. The next generation had moved to other professions, to other countries. The pieces of the family business were sold off, one after the other, to public shareholders, to larger mining operations, to anyone interested. By the time the museum opened on the corner of 5th Avenue and 89th Street, with a band and a speech by the mayor, the family's industrial atomic number had been emitted entirely into the public memory. Because by 1975, the children, the sons of the sons, had descended into something that isn't often talked about. Several of them withdrew into private life. Several of them went quietly mad. The last direct heir of Meyer Guggenheim, George Denver Guggenheim, died in 1959 with a mountain of debt and an estate of less than what Meyer had been worth when he had landed on the boats in Philadelphia. The end was unspectacular. By 2100, the descendants had quietly distributed the rest of what was held in trust into a small portfolio of foundations, museum endowments, fellowship lists. The conjunction that had been the family empire was, by the 1990s, an advantageous series of chairs in cultural institutions. And then there was Peggy. Peggy Guggenheim was the daughter of Benjamin Guggenheim, the brother who had gone down in the Titanic. She was born 2 months after his death in 1998, depending on which version of the record you read, and raised after her mother Florette died on Mount Desert Island in 1937 by a sister of her father's, by the Baroness, and by a succession of concubines and business managers whose names she could never quite remember. She moved to Paris in her early 20s. She lived in the 1920s and 30s the life of a moderately indifferent rich girl with bad teeth. In the late 30s, after her mother died, she took $155,000 out of her share of the family trust. Peggy used to claim $150,000 was the entire fund she inherited, and she began to spend it all on one side of the modern art trade. She bought Picassos. She bought Brancusi. She bought Miros and Magrittes, and a great number of artists she was the first in the world to claim. She bought her cousin Harry's confidence. She also, by 1941, had been living in Paris, working on Vichy, had been briefly arrested in Marseille for alleged collaboration, had at the time a particular friendship with the German playwright Samuel Beckett, had promised to be a messenger for a series of Jewish artists trying to escape through Marseille, and had bought a chain of very valuable paintings that had made her, in the eyes of quiet family members on the upper floors, a difficult Guggenheim. She sent a note to her cousin. The cousin sent an attorney. The cousin told her, by all accounts, that she was a disgrace. The family informed her, by way of his aunt's intermediary, that she was not invited to the wedding of another cousin. She ran the gallery Art of the Century on West 57th Street in Manhattan from 1942 to 1947. She had her own relationships with the art world. Peggy had just left her own business and was in love, around the same time, with Robert Motherwell, with Jackson Pollock, and with the painter Marcel Duchamp. She had a museum on East 61st Street. She sold it at a loss in 1947 and moved to Venice. She bought the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni for an absurd price and turned its unfinished main floor, a single-story squat building looking like a leftover war bunker on the Grand Canal, into the most famous museum for European and American modern art in Europe. She moved her 8 dogs and 8 lovers into the palazzo and lived, until the early 1970s in Venice, on an island occupied by her own family history, on land made possible by her father's monies, in a building no one else in the world owned, surrounded by paintings that the rest of her family considered worthless. She bought the palazzo's collection, in part, by the simple procedure of being a Guggenheim who had a disputed money, and a use for it. She died in 1979 and was buried, by her own instructions, at the small municipal cemetery in the Veneto town of Passiano, in the section for dogs. The palazzo she left behind is now a museum. The ticket can cost you €25 to enter, and the visitors are mostly American art students, and one of the rooms on the upper floor contains a small archival photo of a brooch, and one of Peggy Guggenheim's silver bracelets and the words in her own hand, "My favorite word forever is bets." Hormeldel. If you have stayed with this story so far, you have already passed the part where the family was unified and the part where the family was rich. The remaining question, and the one I want to fill in here in the last section, is where are they now and what does it mean that a family of that size turned out this way? Here is what remains. There is a museum on Fifth Avenue. There is a Guggenheim in Bilbao, designed by Frank Gehry, opened in 1997, paid for in part by the family. There is a foundation that gives fellowships each year to a number of mostly invisible, mostly old American artists and scholars. There are, by a few living counts, between 25 and 30 living descendants of Meyer Guggenheim, scattered between Manhattan, Nantucket, Aspen, and wherever else members of an old family go when the family trust has been distributed enough times. Many of them are not Guggenheim in any ordinary sense. They are Roosevelts, by their mother's third marriage. They are in possession of a small amount of the Guggenheimian. They are people who have been taught, since they were children, to stand when other people mention the family's name. A family gets remembered by the buildings it leaves behind, and the Guggenheims left buildings in New York, Venice, Bilbao, and in the long blue memory of every mining town in Colorado where the slag heaps are still being cleaned up by EPA trustees. They also left patterns left entirely in private rooms. The way a daughter learns that her family has an opinion about whom she can marry, in what way, at what age, the way a brother who lost 2 of his brothers in accidents in different decades never had the luxury to publicly grieve, the way a family can build a fortune in one century and run it down in the next, leaving a building as the only thing still standing. The Guggenheim Museum on Fifth Avenue is the most famous building in America that is the last remaining public evidence of an American dynasty that lasted just long enough to tell you why it wouldn't last longer. If you go up the inside of it, the curved walls are cool to the touch. The paintings hang on a ramp that goes by the way the building goes, and the rooms at the top. Display rooms for a permanent collection. Look toward the park in such a way that you are reminded of the way the founders looked at the world. With control. The curse of which is, in the end, what makes this story worth telling. Every dynasty, from the heights it climbs to, ends up asking its children a single, cruel question. Can you live inside your father's life? The Guggenheims, more clearly than most, answered by their absence, no. Their children went to museums they were not allowed to vote in. They went to fellowships they could not influence. They stayed in families whose names they could not pronounce. They went, inevitably, somewhere else. The buildings are still there, the chairs are still there, the names of the dead ones are still there. But the family that once controlled the world's silver, copper, and lead industry, that family is mostly gone, and gone in the way only a dynasty can go, by the slow process of being replaced, from inside, by a long line of ordinary people. It ends the way dynasties always end, not with a fire, not with a single lawsuit, with one quiet cousin on one quiet Tuesday deciding that the museum is fine and the meeting is not, and moving the chair back from the table.